Simon Templar.
I think that Roger Moore has that light touch, that it's just here and now, and it couldn't be any other way except the way he's presenting it, and it's all very easy, very light.
And the mouth is beautiful.
Roger has been blessed and, in a way, cursed with this handsome face. I thought as a director I'd like to get him to shave his head, you know, and give him a broken nose and then say, now do this. And I think you get a great performance out of him.
I jokingly say, you know, what's the difference between playing the Saint and playing Bond? That in the Saint I did raise my eyebrow, and I don't think I ever raised my eyebrow in Bond, except possibly when a bomb went off.
When Sean Connery played James Bond, he played it as the bad boy womanizer. And when Roger Moore played Bond, he played it as the man that maybe would marry the heroine if the circumstances were right.
I was born in South London. Today it's rather posh, they call it St. Ockwell. There were just the three of us, my mother, my father, and myself. And in those days, policemen, well, I don't suppose they get a great deal of money today, but we certainly weren't amongst the well-off, although I never seemed to want for anything.
I was very surprised to find out that he came from exactly the same place as me and was the son of a London policeman, which means that in the class structure, sort of lower middle class or upper poor people. Roger, I think, learned to laugh in dire circumstances, no matter what they were like, because Roger was a very sickly boy. He spent the first many years of his life in and out of hospital.
When we were alone with them, they would always sort of bring up the fact how lucky we were and how, when Roger was a kid, you know, the treat of the week was baked beans on toast.
His parents were very, very protective of him, because physically he wasn't strong, and therefore he was never let out on the street like I was to play with the other boys and involve himself in the rough and tumble. And when he was, he couldn't defend himself. And so you will find that anybody who can't fight becomes very, very funny, because they like to turn it around with a laugh. And Roger could always turn a dangerous situation into a funny one. And this was based on his early childhood. Plus, of course, he had the protective backup of the fact that his father was a policeman, and a very big one.
My grandfather, George Moore, who was also a lifeguard, very strong, very disciplined. I think was very strict with my father.
My father used to grab me, I remember, by the belt of my raincoat and pull it in tight and say, "You're like a bag of potatoes tied up in the middle, ugly." So I guess I was plump. The only sport I was really good at school was swimming. It was the only thing I ever won at. And I never could run. And this race went on, and I ran, and the race was over, but I was still running. I was nowhere near the end. And the next race had started, and I was still running, and I eventually got up to the winning stand, and the judges' stand, and I stood there, and I stood there, and I stood there, and eventually they gave me a bag of toffees to get rid of me. So I've always figured you really don't have to make that much effort to get out in front to win, because you'll get a bag of toffees in the end. My father was an amateur actor amongst many activities that he did. He produced and he directed and he built the sets and he did the makeup and he starred in amateur productions for the police. The war started. They were already digging trenches in Hyde Park and we'd all been issued with gas masks. All the kids from London, the big cities, were evacuated. They put cardboard labels on our jackets, our little blue raincoats. We carried our gas mask in a cardboard box and we were put on trains and shipped off. I went to a place called Worthing on the south coast of England, which probably the closest point to Germany, which was a great place to send the kids from London.
It was really scary because we were billeted on people who
didn't know who we were and a different way of life.
And then came back to London just before Dunkirk, which I remember very well, seeing the trains with the wounded passing at Clapham North, near where we lived. And then the blitzes started. After a few weeks, it was a bit hairy. We lived at night in an Anderson shelter in the garden, which was a sort of round corrugated iron covered bit of dirt. It kept shrapnel from damaging you, but it would not sustain a direct hit. By that time, my school, Battersea Grammar School, didn't exist in London, and we were put into a central school, and I was able to pursue what I really wanted to do was art. And by the time I was 15 and a half, my father had shown some of my work to a colleague of his who knew people in the film industry. And I was offered a job as an animated well, I was offered a job as a tea boy in an animated film business. And that was the beginning of my real interest in film. And I learnt at that point what cutting was and editing was, which came in great stead much later when I was able to direct when I started doing the Saints series.
I think that it was by pure chance that I think he became an actor. He would absolutely have a career as a sketch artist, without a doubt. I mean, he's brilliant at it.
Anyway, I left my employment there. I was fired, I was booted out. I then had some friends who were doing crowd work on a film called Caesar and Cleopatra. And I don't know, I often joke about it afterwards, either my spear was longer than anybody else or my toga shorter. But I was, somebody said, you know, are you an actor? Do you want to be an actor? And I met with a director, and he said, I think that you should be trained. And so I thought, oh, how wonderful. He said, I'd like to speak with your parents. So I rushed home and I told my mother I was going to be Stuart Granger. But I did go to the Royal Academy of Dramatic Art for a year. It was fascinating because the moment I started at RADA, I knew that I was where I belonged, where I wanted to be, doing what I really wanted to do. It had never occurred to me before that I wanted to be an actor. And then I left RADA and I got a job with Norman Marshall at Cambridge, the Arts Theatre, a festival ashore. And I was called up for a physical, and I found myself doing 6 weeks primary training in the Army. And then I was sent to a WOSB, a War Office Selection Board, for commissioning. I suppose it was because I spoke posh, I don't know, because I'd been to RADA.
And he had also been an officer in the Army, the exact opposite of what I'd been. I'd been a private in the Army, had a very thick Cockney accent, and hadn't been to any academy at all.
In England, there's a class structure, a very well-defined, if you will, class structure. And it's one of the few countries where you can tell the class or the breeding that an individual has by the way that he or she speaks.
Leaving the Army, having been completely spoiled, having achieved the rank of acting captain, and having my food found and being given money to spend, I came back to the harsh reality of life as a struggling young actor. And it was audition after audition. I had to scratch around and make a living. I did repertory. I did coughs and sneezes in a couple of films. I worked in television in those days at the BBC, which stood me into very good stead because in 1953 I came to the United States, to New York, and did quite a lot of live television work. Robert Montgomery Presents, Hallmark. And also in 1953 I was cast in a play called A Pin to See the Peep Show, which opened on September the 17th, 1953, and closed, unfortunately, on September the 17th, 1953. By that time, with all the television work I'd been doing, I'd been spotted by what they had then were talent scouts at the studios. And I was offered contracts by MGM. My first picture, which was The Last Time I Saw Paris, with Elizabeth Taylor and Van Johnson. And I think I was pretty awful in it.
Well, I was in the publicity department at MGM Studios. We seemed to hit it off immediately because it turned out that we were both Cockneys. We were both evacuated during the war. And the first time I met him was on the set of The Last Time I Saw Paris. He didn't have a very large speaking part, but it was a focal part in the film. And we felt that he was going to be the successor, possible successor to Stuart Granger.
I guess I've known Roger since the 1950s, but at that time he was probably the most beautiful leading man in Hollywood.
I don't think that MGM, when they put him under contract, thought he had a range. I think they hired him as so-called, in quotes, a pretty boy from England who had had a background and a craft, and they thought that he could put him in roles with major stars where he could play second leads and so forth.
Brazenly proclaim me your harlot.
Diane! I married Catherine, but I never promised to stop loving you.
All the people I worked with were always very kind to me. And Lana, in leading role in a film, and she was very patient with me. We had quite a lot of scenes to do together. During the making of Diane, I had my first unpleasant encounter with a horse. As the King of France, my armor was gold, and it was all real armor that they had me in. And I had to kick my horse out before a jousting tournament and sort of gallop off. And the horse took off, and my hands that wouldn't close because of all the metal over my fingers wouldn't go over wouldn't hold the reins. And I lost the reins. And I couldn't grip with my knee because I got this metal. And the horse turned right and I turned left, and I hit a set of concrete steps. And I remember being put into an ambulance and whipped off to Queen of the Angels Hospital. And there was about 45 minutes while I was lying in a reception area where they argued. I was lying on the floor. They were arguing who was going to pay. Diane turned out to be not that great a movie. And I left MGM. You know, it's that when they take out that little notice in the trades that you've severed relationships. They put it in a rather nice way, which everybody in the business knew that you'd been dropped. And I went back to England. The Adventures of Ivanhoe. There I was after playing the King of France. I was back in armor again as Ivanhoe. But fortunately, I'd learnt my lesson, and my armor was made of a lot lighter material. I did 39 episodes of that. The first, unfortunately, they never shot it in color. You know, I mean, it would have stuck around. Or maybe I'm very lucky it didn't stick around. When I was doing Ivanhoe, I thought, well, now I have gone into television, I will never go back to films. And then, fortunately, a film came up, an offer to go back to Hollywood to test for a film called The Miracle that Irving Rapper was directing and Carol Baker was going to be in.
We're going to have Vittorio Gassman from Italy, Katina Paxinou, who was a legend, a legendary character actress from Greece, and an exciting young man from Great Britain, Roger Moore. I was terribly impressed with Roger. He was so beautiful.
Tell him I leave early in the morning to report for duty.
before I started the film, they said, would I work with the dialogue director, or Joe Graham? And I said, why? You know, because you sound too English. And he analyzed the problem straight away. I spoke with a clenched jaw. And Joe said, did you go to university? I said, no. He said, do you regret not having been to university? I said, yes. He said, do you feel that when you're talking to people who probably have been to university, that you might make a mistake in what you're saying? I said, yes. He said, well, that is in your subconscious, and so all the time you don't open your mouth because you're frightened of what's going to come out. He said, you're very fortunate. He said, you're even-featured, you're 6'2". Why do you stand 5'10"? Don't be timid, don't be embarrassed. It is a sin not to expose what you've been given. And he really nagged me. And I found I didn't want to be on a set without Joe. He gave me a great deal of confidence and made me enjoy acting much more.
When I first met Roger, he was standing at the end of a swimming pool in these very short shorts, just about to dive in. And he was so absolutely beautiful. Actors, a lot of them are very egomaniacs. You know, all they want to do is shove you out the way and look in the mirror. But Roger has never done that.
He was not only an actor when I first met him, he was also a very famous male model. He modelled so many pullovers, we used to call him the Big Knit. I think sometimes, from a point of view of just being an actor, he would have preferred to be slightly more uneven featured.
To have even features is an asset, but by the same token, to be taken seriously as an actor, you always feel that you're rather like the empty-headed blonde. They say, oh no, well, you know, if they look good, then they can't act. I suppose Warner Brothers in the late 50s and early 60s was rather like rank had been before I came out of the army. You know, there were so many people under contract. I think there were about 50 of us under contract at Warner Brothers. We all looked alike. We were all interchangeable. Even the girls looked like the boys. And the boys looked like the girls. Apart from Jim Garner and Clint Walker.
It was terribly difficult being a contract player, and you could not get a part, a good part in a film, unless you signed, because they wanted to own you. They didn't actually care in what way they used you, as long as you were fulfilling your arrangement with them and you were working for your money.
Basically all I know is in the 50s when he came out here, he loved it. He just went out and bought a car and you know, and he was in Hollywood.
When I finished The Miracle, they wanted to put me under contract and to start off by doing a television series called The Alaskans. There was a writer's strike, and we got the scripts from Maverick, and they didn't even bother to well, they changed the names, but they didn't change the dialogue. I replaced Jim Garner in Maverick. They said I wasn't replacing Jim Garner in Maverick, but all the clothes had Garner written around the waistband, and they had to be taken in an inch.
And then he became Cousin Bo Maverick. And I think that after a while, you know, there was much rebellion. There was James Garner rebelled, and many of the other stars did. And I think that's why, when the Alaskans came to an end, Roger decided to go back to England and see if he could get something else.
I'm afraid I gave up the song and dance routine a long time ago.
What do you mean routine? We want you on the show just as you are. The one and only, unique, unbeatable, famous Simon Tepler.
I think the opportunity that Roger had in starring in The Saint was what every actor dreams about, the romantic hero who gets involved in every conceivable kind of adventure that one can have. And of course, you know, it's now history because it seems to have played forever.
The Saint, it was sort of like Roger. He was almost playing himself. Very charming, very witty, great looking, perfect leading man. all the things that audiences around the world have grown to love and adore about Roger.
Before I was a writer, I was kind of an actress for about 5 minutes, and during the course of that 5 minutes, I got a role in The Saint. He was always very kind to his leading ladies, because he had a different one every week, I might add. He had the most beautiful women that were, you know, in English films.
Vert et servez avec une tranche de citron. Alors, fais pique. Oh, un garçon.
Oui, monsieur.
Et la même chose pour moi.
Merci, monsieur.
Thank you very much.
You're more than welcome.
I wish I could speak French.
I think all the true serious stars, they have a charisma and they bring something to the character that is within them. And I think that's what Roger did with The Saint.
After the first few episodes, naturally one settles into not having to search how you're going to play it, because it is just automatic.
I just can't believe you got away with it.
Did I promise I would?
Yes. Yes, you're wonderful.
Knowing the way the character thinks, of course, it makes it very easy in terms of directing yourself.
There's nobody in it.
He was afraid you'd go right into him.
What?
This is as far as I go, Simon. I'll have those plans, please.
My. Life is full of surprises.
The Saint went on for about six years. And during that time, my daughter Deborah was born and my son Jeffrey. And then when I started Bond, along came Christian. It was like going to the office. I had a regular job. I would go to the studio early every morning and would come home every night. So although it was very comforting, I was probably glad to finish The Saint and tackle new pastures.
Hi!
Oh, hello, I did ring.
Here, hold this.
I said I did ring, but you probably didn't hear for the sound of the music.
Sorry?
I said you probably... Why didn't you switch that thing off?
I think I'll switch that thing off.
Lou Grade went to America and came back and said, I've sold The Persuaders, which had been an idea Bob Baker and I had had while we were doing The Saint. And the character we had in mind to be the other man, which Tony Curtis eventually played, because Tony's wonderful sense of comedy would play very well against my laid-back English lord.
Be much closer if you would stop complaining.
Do you mind very much if we stop for a minute?
Why not?
Oh, how is it you're always clean?
Because I think clean.
Oh, dear. The Persuaders concept was really like an American being an Englishman's servant. It was not unlike Rochester and Jack Benny's relationship in their films.
He played Lord Sinclair, sort of a very sophisticated, rich, get away with everything, and he sort of teams up with Tony Curtis, who's comes from the streets, New Jersey.
He spoke, English like the English, and I spoke English like the Hungarians. Goodbye.
Is this an excuse me, or can we all join in?
Sorry.
I like it.
Yes, well, just remember where we stopped.
Stay close behind.
I may never leave.
We found that the two characters we were playing, Lord Brett Sinclair and Danny Wilde, we took a lot from ourselves, our own personalities, and Tony and I today, have this same sort of relationship that those two characters on the screen had.
We were both in the same period of time in our lives. We're about the same age, and we have had, by that time, 20 years experience working in movies, so it made it a lot easier for us to work together. In England, we'd clear the streets. When the Persuaders played, people would run into their pubs or wherever and watch those shows. So it was extraordinarily successful all over Europe.
Sean then announced that his last one was going to be Diamonds Are Forever. Then I got a call from Harry Saltzman saying that Cubby and I want you to take over Bond. And so they were looking around for another Bond, and they came to me. And they agreed that I would do it. I'd get calls from Cubby saying, Harry thinks you're too fat. And so I'd take weight off, and then Harry'd call and say, Cubby thinks your hair's too long, get your hair cut. And I kept on losing weight and getting my hair cut. And in the end, I got so desperate, I said, why didn't you get a thin actor with short hair in the first place? Why did you put me through this absolute torture?
He has a tremendous sense of humor and is very good at skating. He skates lightly over his own life and persona, and he does that in his work too.
Sean, and I hope I'm not misrepresenting him here, is a very serious Scotsman who nevertheless can lighten his act. Whereas Roger is a very sunny type of character who occasionally is obliged to darken his act.
I don't think I was consciously set out to be different in playing Bond. The one thing that Guy Hamilton said, well, let's not have any of you say any of those things as associated with Sean, such as martini shaken, not stirred.
When Sean Connery played James Bond, he played it as the bad boy womanizer. And when Roger Moore played Bond, he played it as the man that maybe would marry the heroine if the circumstances were right.
There's really nothing very much for us to do tonight. Or is there?
Oh, darling, I'm tempted.
And there was never any feeling of tremendous, rampant sexuality. It was always seduction, and with a very, very light touch and a smile. With the women, I think the difference between Sean and Roger was that Sean machoed them into bed, and Roger laughed them into it.
Good afternoon. A water pistol.
Roger brought something different to the character, and I think he came along at a time when Bond really needed to change. Because if you continue in the same vein, I think Bond would have become stale.
The girls had bigger parts in the Roger films because the first one was in 1963, which was a very, very different area to late 70s, and there was much more female emancipation. So the girls became more predominant in the films. Therefore, Roger had to adapt to the modern climate, and he was lucky because he was the right type at the right time.
During the 60s, there was a certain intensity of the Cold War. There was Vietnam. When the 70s came, I think there was a loosening up of, throughout the whole world, in attitudes. And it was difficult to play the sort of the Cold War as seriously as it had been played in the past. So the lighter touch seemed to fit in with the audience's expectations, and Roger was the perfect Bond for that.
I've lost my charm!
Not from where I'm standing.
He's not necessarily that sort of macho, male, hero type guy, that image that he has. Because I was playing backgammon with him at his house in Italy a number of years ago, and we were sitting outside underneath this pine tree, when suddenly, out of the tree, fell this little moving thing, followed by another little moving thing going splat. And they were baby rats, which were being scared out of this tree by this snake, which had crawled up. Well, suddenly the snake falls out and lands about 3 inches from between Roger and myself. Roger leaps up with a great big scream, I mean like a frightened housewife looking for a broom or something, screaming for his wife Louisa to come to the rescue.
I remember one day I said to him, "Are you going to watch the Muhammad Ali fight?" And he grew quite violent, funnily enough, about boxing. He said, "I hate boxing. I hate anything to do with physical violence." That was the only time I ever seen him be violent, telling me how violent he wasn't.
The stunts that he was asked to do. We very rarely had to do things over.
He took a lot of those stunts and a lot of those things that he had to do, they were really very hard on him physically. And having been in quite a few of those scenes, I know myself how much was being asked of you.
I've always been very fortunate to find doubles that looked exactly like me.
We had to do this fall scene where I'm falling off a cliff and he's holding on to me, and we had these wind machines that were blowing rocks in our face, and it took the entire day, and it was very uncomfortable for both of us. We almost lost our sense of humor at times, and it hurt. My knees were being scraped on the wall, and I think there was a football on my stomach that was supposed to give me this rolling motion as he was holding on to me. It was very uncomfortable for both of us, and he never complained. I was ready to quit. I was ready to scream and say, "Get me off of here, I want to go home." And I probably might have done something like that if it wasn't for the fact that he gives you this feeling that you got to hang in there and you got to do it, and if Roger can do it, you're willing to do anything.
The two films that I did with Roger, The Spy Who Loved Me and Moonraker, he was quite unique that he was the same right the way through the film. I mean, these films took 20 weeks to make, and they were very, very tiring for the actor. But Roger was always the same.
I found that Lewis and I have exactly the same sense of humor, the same sense of fun.
Roger is always on the light side. Roger has a wonderful self-deprecating humor. He's great on the set. He keeps the crew in stitches most of the day, and his natural tendency is just to make fun of everything.
He does not regard everything as a laugh, but he will die rather than let you see it.
A lot of the time I laugh at myself, and I think it's a defense mechanism because I want to laugh at myself before anybody else does. Also, I seem to have read somewhere that being a comedian is a desire to be loved.
Certain things I think did come to him easily, like his wit. The wit is always there, his intelligence always comes through. But he's also the ultimate professional.
He's smart. He knows how to pick up little pieces of business. He knows how to, if not ad-lib, he certainly knows how to improvise.
Roger's being chased by a tiger. Out of nowhere, Roger turned around and went, "Sit!" And the tiger sits. This wasn't scripted. This was Roger's sort of clever thought, and it was kept in the movie.
I hope you can swim tonight.
Why this continuing success of a series of films? And I think it's because the audiences were never cheated. The money was put up on the screen. It's the comforting thing of a bedtime story. Children like to hear the same story every night. You mustn't change it. It's, "Oh, no, it wasn't like that. You know, the witch came in and then that happened." And I think Bond became an old friend with audiences. They knew every 2 years that there would be this great outgoing of action and glamour and humor.
Forgive my curiosity, but what is that?
That's my little octopusy.
What an unexpected pleasure. Welcome to the Majava Club.
He is so good looking and so nice that he always had to play the clean-cut hero. And I've always had a feeling, I've never talked to him about this, but I'd always had a feeling that Roger would love to play sort of Hannibal Lecter or some really dastardly character. He really would.
I was slightly jealous of the villains. And they could step outside themselves. If you play the villain, you can say, right, now there is nothing of me in this because this is the villain. And he is rotten through and through, but he believes he is wonderful. Whereas when you're playing the hero, you're just being very nice.
I think somewhere in Roger's soul there is someone who would have loved to have been absolutely confrontational. In his heart, he would love to have been an actor who was confrontational and big and up there. He would love to be that as a person.
Roger is really quite shy, I think. It's difficult to get to the real close to Roger, and I've only seen it a few times, but in those moments you really feel so much love for him, because he is a wonderful man with a great character, and I think if I were to explore the reasons why he is this way, I think part of it is what all actors, I think, feel, which is a lot of actors become actors because they want to be someone else other than themselves.
I love it when I can put things on noses and moustaches and beards. I did a film called The Man Who Haunted Himself, which I had a moustache, something to hide behind. And I played a dual role. I played my evil self, my alter ego. I remember one episode of The Persuaders, which I was able to play my aunt and my uncle and my grandfather.
Let them feel a touch of good old cold British steam.
It's the same in our family, you know, isn't it, Lance, dear?
That's really fun when you've got something to hide behind, and if you make an absolute bloody fool of yourself, nobody can see it was you. I did a film called Folks, or North Sea Hijack. It had all sorts of titles, in which I played this character, Folks, who was a misogynist.
Whereas most actors think they're better than they are, Roger doesn't think that. And I think the way that I worked with him basically was to give him that confidence that really basically there was a very good actor struggling to get out. There was a scene in the first film I did with Roger, which was The Spy Who Loved Me, in which the Barbara Bach had to tell him that she knew that he had killed her lover. That was kind of difficult scene for him because James Bond didn't show too much emotion. But suddenly there were scenes which he acted absolutely straight. He didn't try to send it up or be James Bond. They were quite serious scenes. And that's when I suddenly felt, my God, you can do something really well. You can really act.
It's our business and your people get killed. We both know that. So did he.
My style of acting is the style that if the acting shows there's something wrong with it, that you shouldn't be seen to be acting.
You don't see the acting because he has a very light, a wonderful touch. You know, there are some actors who say, like I think it was a great line of Betty Davis, you mustn't ever make them think it's easy. You must make them think it's difficult. You've got to show them that you're acting. Well, I'm not sure that I quite agree with that. I think the wonderful thing is to make a performance feel as though it's just happening at the moment.
You learn the lines and you do the work. You don't need to send off your mind in some peculiar place. If you've got to get angry, you can't say, well, I remember when my mother's sister's brother got angry at his wife and her son, Fred, came up to me and punched me in the mouth, so I felt bad.
It doesn't mean at all that they don't use, in the style of the method, the experiences in life that they have had, that they don't draw on that experience, that they don't dip into the well, so to speak, and use real-life experience in their roles. It's simply that they refuse to talk about it. They have a feeling that the more you talk about it, the more damaging it is to the actual performance. They don't talk a great Hamlet, they do a great Hamlet. That's the English style, and that's Roger's style.
1, 2, 7, take 4A camera. And stand by, please. And action, figuration.
Well, I think all of us were disappointed when Roger left the Bond films, but Tide and Tide waits for no man, I suppose, and Roger felt that it was time to hang up the spurs, so to speak. But we had a good run, 7 movies, all of which were successful and profitable, loved by millions.
After 7 Bonds, I think I had a feeling that everybody had had enough of me and I'd had enough of Bond. Although I pride myself on being reasonably fit. It becomes rather a dirty movie with James, an old James Bond, leering and leching at young leading ladies. They would have to be getting old character actresses to play the lead, to play the Bond girls.
When one is in Egypt, one should delve deeply into its treasures.
If there's anything you would like, anything at all.
Well, I had lunch, but I seem to have missed dessert.
Roger brought humor to the part. He brought elegance. And I think should be credited for the fact that Bond went on for as long as it did.
I don't think there's been any one particular film where I've been called upon to show my vast range. Because, you know, heroes don't cry, heroes don't break down, or not the type of heroes, or films that I played heroes in.
That's, of course, the front that is typically English, what they call a stiff upper lip. Roger happens to be a master of it, making all of his points, extracting every ounce of humor and every ounce of suspense and drama out of a situation, and making it all look sort of easy. That's the old English professionalism, and Roger has that.
Englishmen, if you look at the war films, never showed much emotion. That was a very, very American thing. Englishmen don't cry. Of course, they cry in real life, but they didn't cry in their acting. They never had self-pity. They never went in for that kind of acting. You never saw English actors with tears in their eyes. And that was English life. And that's what Roger portrayed. He was the essential Englishman.
I think one of the reasons why my father had such comfort with Roger and such a strong friendship and love for Roger was that Roger was really a younger version of himself.
I'd met David Niven during my animation cartooning days. One of the films we were making was an instructional film for the 17-pounder gun, and David was the technical officer, technical advisor. Of course, he didn't remember me as that lowly little snotty-nosed office boy.
I mean, there are many sides to Roger. Most of us, or most of you, will have seen the fun, humorous person, but there is underneath all that a very caring, a very sensitive family man who is, for me, like the older brother that I never had. And when my father died, I was in California, my brother was shooting the rapids in Colorado, and my youngest sister was with our father when he died and couldn't find my brother and myself. So she called Roger in the south of France looking for some help. I mean, here she was with a young teenager with a dead person in the house and didn't know what to do. And so Roger said, "Don't worry, I will be on the next plane and I'll be up there in a few hours." And he called the airport. He was down in the south of France. He called the airport in Nice. The planes were full. He could not get on, so he and his daughter, Deborah, drove throughout the night. They drove 16 hours to get to my father's house and to see my sister and to take care of the whole thing, which he did. And he was starting a Bond picture in 3 days' time.
One of the things that you have to look at in films, that all the great film actors had one tremendous thing. They had a form of stillness, and they seemed to play themselves in the Gary Cooper school or the James Stewart school. Roger was in that school. In other words, he didn't seem to do much, but what he did do, he did very, very well indeed.
I think that what happens in light comedy is that timing is everything. And that is an art unto itself. And Rex Harrison had it, my father, I think, had it, Cary Grant had it, and Roger Moore definitely has it.
One actress I worked with in a modeling photograph many, many years ago, and then we had a spit and a cough in the same movie, but we never met. But we became friends and we became neighbors, as Audrey Hepburn. And one of the great things that Audrey did for me was to introduce me to UNICEF.
That is a side of Roger that, to me, reveals the fact that he's a man who will give, who will sacrifice his own comfort, give of his own time, and give of his feeling and of his compassion to those who are less fortunate. So there is definitely that side to Roger, although he may not very often reveal it on the screen.
And I think that the fact that also that he was very, very, say, poorly and sickly as a child, has come round into full circle now with his work now for UNICEF, which is for sick and starving and children in trouble all over the world. This is not some man who is going out to try and show that he is a great charitable figure or anything. I mean, he does most of it very quietly.
I call him a life enhancer because that's what he does. He brings a tremendous amount of pleasure to people with his work, with his personality.
I'm glad to meet you.
I'm very glad that Roger has been given the opportunity to work for UNICEF in the last few years, but he is giving not only to the children that are benefiting, but also to all of us, in that it shows us who he really is.
Roger's one of the few actors who I think has really gotten better looking with age. He still has that charm, that twinkle. There's that naughty twinkle in Roger's eyes and in his facial expressions. And I think that's really what people will remember Roger as, that he had this wonderful niche as a charming, humorous leading man.
I've often tried to remember what the first film I saw was. I know there was Tarzan around at that time. Actually, it wasn't Elmo Lincoln, Johnny Weissmuller. Little did I think when I'd sit in those picture palaces that I one day would sort of be up on those big screens doing it myself. I'd have paid more attention, I think, if I had.
Bond, what do you think you're doing?
Keeping the British hand up, sir.
Nobody does it better.